Hello and welcome to this training on basics of environmental auditing. I'm Vivi from the National Audit Office of Finland, where I've been leading the INTOSAI Working Group on environmental auditing for 6 years. I have also performance audit background both at the National Audit Office of Finland and at the European Court of Auditors. So my experience is very much concentrated in Europe, but during the last 6 years I've also received a pretty good global understanding on the situation, and that's something I try to share with you today. So we are going to talk first a bit about what is environmental auditing. We will talk more about performance auditing and what are the aspects that make environmental auditing specific compared to audits on other policy areas. I will provide some audit examples and present support material. Some of the environmental problems are very local in nature. It could be water pollution, and they could take a bit different format. So in the left-hand side, you see a picture of eutrophication, where excess nutrient enters into water, for instance, from the agriculture. On the right-hand side, you see plastic pollution. But what is common to these problems is the fact that the root causes are same. It's about the way we treat environment, how we utilize natural resources, and whether we enough take into account the way we treat the environment. On top of that, there are also truly global problems such as climate change. So it doesn't matter where you emit the greenhouse gases, they enter into our common atmosphere. But there, even the consequences can be very different. There might be countries or regions or places where there's too much water because of climate change, but there might be areas where there's too little water. So what is environmental auditing? You might sometimes hear about environmental auditing, for instance, in the quality assurance systems of environmental management systems. But this is not what we are talking today. We are talking about environmental auditing in the context of supreme audit institutions as government's external auditors. So it's about auditing the spending and implementation of policies in environmental field. It's a similar exercise that could be made on any policy area of the government. What is specific with environmental governance that it's a relatively new area, and it institutionalized, at least in Western countries, by the end of 1980s. And even later than that came the climate regime and ministries of climate or climate matters integrated in the environmental or energy ministries. But it's not only about ministries of environment or ministries of climate, but it's also about other ministries' actions that affect environment. So many sectors could have an impact, and we could audit that as well from the environmental perspective. For example, ministries of finance make very important decisions that affect environment. One example is green fiscal policy tools. This is a project we completed this year, led by European Court of Auditors and INTOSAI USA, and where we presented these various green fiscal policy tools such as fees and subsidies and public procurement, like indeed those fiscal policies that can have a huge impact on the environment. INTOSAI Working Group on Environmental Auditing, or WGEA as we call it, has been a key developer. It was founded already in 1992 by 12 SAIs, and today it's a vibrant group with 86 members worldwide. WGEA develops audit methodology, recognizes new rising topics, and provides training and platform for peer exchange. So let's talk a bit about the financial compliance and performance auditing. Traditionally, for instance, WGEA has very much developed performance auditing, but there has been recently increasing interest in financial auditing as well, because of sustainability reporting and questions related to assurance of those reports. WGEA concluded recently a project on sustainability reporting, and there is also in the pipeline a project on assurance of climate disclosures. And in the picture you see this question of double materiality, the impact materiality and financial materiality. Looking at the compliance audit, this is also something that could be integrated together with performance audits. One very specific element in environmental audit space are the multilateral environmental agreements. So these environmental agreements provide options for doing a compliance audit, but most of all, they can be useful sources of audit criteria. So if your country has signed, is a party of a multilateral environmental agreement, you could very well use the agreement as a source of audit criteria. But even if your country is not a party, it still represents the best practice worldwide. And an excellent resource for these multilateral environmental agreements is Informea, a website hosted by United Nations Environment Programme. So you can find all the agreements there, but you can also find free online courses that you can take on a specific matter if you are, for instance, planning an audit on the topic. One example could be the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And if we look at the biodiversity targets, for instance, target number 3, conserve 30% of land, waters and seas, that's a target that you could use as a source of audit criteria. You could ask whether your government has obliged with the target, whether it's integrated in the policies or in the legal background, and then you could go on auditing how well that target has been implemented. Other examples I picked here are on number 13 on sharing benefits for genetic resources, digital sequence information and traditional knowledge. So you could ask your government, what have you done with this? Or number 14 on integrating biodiversity in all decision making. So this means doing an audit from a policy coherence perspective. As another example, Paris Agreement in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. If we, for instance, look at Article 7, paragraph 5, parties acknowledge that adaptation action should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory and fully transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities and ecosystems and so on. So that's quite clearly something that could act as a useful source of audit criteria. I have here an example on Tuvalu's audit on coastal adaptation. So Site Tuvalu used as an audit criteria that all relevant stakeholders and marginalized groups were engaged. what the audit found were quite positive audit findings. That the project included consultations, the coastal adaptation project, which also includes reclaiming a new land from the sea. Island councils and communities were actively involved, and the participatory approach built trust, enhanced local stewardship, and encouraged responsible management practices. So this is also a good example that the audits do not necessarily only mean that you are criticizing, finding what went wrong, but if there are good audit findings, you should also report on them in order to provide a balanced overview. That performance audit from Sain Tuvalu can be found also in the Global Climate Adaptation Audit Summary. It summarizes over 50 performance audits worldwide on climate adaptation. So this has been a big exercise that was just recently completed, this summary report. So there's a lot of valuable information and hopefully also inspiration for further audits. As I mentioned, environmental auditing has traditionally focused on performance auditing. Looking at our latest survey made in 2024, we asked what are the competencies of environmental auditors. And we see that in all regions, the most typical competency of environmental auditors is the experience on performance auditing. This is already an older picture from the European Court of Auditors, thematizing the differences between financial or compliance audits and performance audits. The key points is that the purpose is to assess whether funds have been used with economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. Focus is not on financial transactions, but rather on policy, program, organization, activities, and management systems. The academic basis is very wide, and methods vary from audit to audit. Audit criteria are unique for individual audit, and reports tend to be special reports in comparison to annual reports. When we talk about performance auditing, there's always these 3 E's. Sometimes there's been a discussion on 4th E, the environment, but now let's stick with the 3 E's of performance auditing. I have there also a link to a very good performance audits guideline, an interactive version developed by European Court of Auditors. So the first E is economy. It is about minimizing the costs of resources, while certainly taking into account time and quality considerations. And these costs can be financial, human, or material costs, but also environmental costs. And what could be some examples in the environmental space? Energy efficiency measures can facilitate cost savings. Poor water management means increased costs in health sector. Environmental subsidies could be excessive or unnecessary, so there shouldn't be this overcompensation either. And resources could be wasted because of conflicting policies. One example is from the Climate Scanner, a big global initiative by INTOSAI Brazil, where a rapid review tool was developed for assessing the status of government's climate policy implementation. So based on 103 reviews, 9 out of 10 countries don't know how much they spend on tackling climate change. Without monitoring, Governments cannot know whether they are truly investing in solving the most critical climate issues, nor can they plan future spending effectively. So that's really very striking finding, which is closely related to economy. Another specific angle could be environmental costs of armed conflicts. So human suffering is certainly the concern number one, but you could also consider the high price that it brings to the environment. Militaries around the world are large greenhouse gas emitters, and armed conflict damage nature and biodiversity and leave behind hazardous waste and pollutants. So there is also this environmental cost perspective. These three E's, economy, efficiency, and economy, can also overlap. One example is environmentally harmful subsidies. So this includes both the economy perspective but also the effectiveness perspective. So governments invest on the one hand in environmental and climate policies, but on the other hand activities that lead to opposite direction. They, for instance, provide subsidies for fossil fuels. There's been estimation of environmentally harmful subsidies that they would be over $2 trillion annually. There have been some audits on the topic. INTOSAI Estonia, for instance, found that government had no idea about the environmentally harmful subsidies or their amount. INTOSAIs of Canada, Finland, and France have focused on fossil fuel subsidies. And there is going to be a new INTOSAI WGEA project on the topic. So if the first E was economy, second is efficiency. Have the resources been put into optimal use? Do we get most of the available resources? Risks could include leakages, low implementation, or productivity issues. And some of the environmental audit examples could be the costs arising from slow implementation when it causes delays. Bad coordination among authorities can cause overlapping work and inefficiencies. Or environmental and climate policy targets have not been achieved cost effectively because most cost-efficient actions, those low-hanging fruits, have not been prioritized. One example on this efficiency perspective is also the waste hierarchy. On the left-hand side, the EU picture, where the diagrams shows that the most efficient option is prevention of waste. Only after that we can start to talk about recycling, recovering, and disposal. And on the right-hand side is a graphic from an audit of European Court of Auditors on food waste, where there are then special elements in the waste hierarchy, like donation and animal feed. But before that comes the prevention. After economy and efficiency, the third E is effectiveness. So meeting the objectives and achieving intended results. So it's really relationship between these intended and actual results. Some audits can find also that the preconditions for assessing effectiveness are missing if there's, for instance, no strategies, no implementation plans, or no monitoring. Once again, environmental audit examples. Intended air pollution reduction targets were not reached. Wastewater fees did not encourage reducing pollution, but were just a tool to collect money to the budget, so they were not steering the action towards reducing pollution. Or it was not possible to assess effectiveness because there was no strategy, implementation plan, or monitoring in place. So I mentioned in the beginning that environmental auditing is like auditing any other policy field. It's a similar performance audit process. Yet there are some elements that make environmental auditing specific. Some aspects, and now I would ask you to consider this question for a while. So you could even pause the video in order to reflect a bit this question. So what makes environmental auditing specific compared to other policy areas? This is not an exhaustive list of everything that's there. These are more like some examples. And who knows, maybe you have invented even additional aspects. But first of them is definitely that environmental topics are often difficult to monetize. So how to put a price tag on biodiversity, clean air, or beauty of a landscape? But although this is difficult, it doesn't mean that they would not have any value. And there are methods that are being developed. There's carbon markets, the value of ecosystem services, that valuation is developed. One good example on these ecosystem services are the pollinators. So these small bees and other insects that provide very valuable pollination services for free. And whole of our food production is very much dependent on these small pollinators. Another specific aspect in environmental auditing could be the importance of non-financial information related to the previous topic. So besides financial information, also non-financial information can be material. It can be more difficult to understand and interpret due to the lack of generally accepted reporting principles or because it's qualitative. Yet, such information can be highly relevant for auditors. In sustainability reporting field, this is just an example from GRI standards and a specific standard on biodiversity. And what are the topics that in this GRI standard on sustainability reporting include? So there are policies to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, management of biodiversity impacts, and access and benefits sharing. In addition, identification of biodiversity impacts, locations with those impacts, direct drivers of biodiversity loss, changes to the state of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So this is just an example to show that there is plenty of work taking place in this topic. We just recently concluded a project on environmental accounting. And there's also been a lot of development in this field, mainly because United Nations system of environmental economic accounting has been developed. But there is more material available on the WGEA website. Another typical perspective for environmental auditing is the long time span. So our auditors might not be accustomed dealing with the long time span that environmental topics often require. So that makes also the auditing challenging because you don't necessarily see the changes very quickly. The long time span makes it challenging to assess the impact of specific policies or programs, among other factors affecting development. So that is one of the challenges. How can we identify what this specific policy made in the end? What difference did it make? One audit example of the long time span is from Canada and how the Office of the Auditor General audited so-called 2 billion tree project. So here, depending on the time span, the results look very different. Because boreal forests grow slowly, if you look only until 2031, it looks like the planting of the forest is actually net greenhouse gas source. But if you adopt a longer time span over to 2050, it becomes a net greenhouse gas sink, meaning that it's positive for the climate. Environmental risks can also be specific and rapid. Although there is very much science, very much research on environment, we don't still know for sure how natural environment works. And one example are the so-called tipping points. So these are the critical thresholds in Earth's system. And a small change can trigger a large and possibly irreversible shift in the state of the system. So it's kind of no point of return situation. And in this video from a global tipping point project shows the situation with coral reefs. And this recent research indeed suggests that coral reef is the first kind of tipping point that is going to occur. Other tipping points include, for instance, the melting of the Arctic ice, or the changes in the big like Gulf Stream, or the loss of Amazon green rainforest. But there can be also some positive tipping points. So one of those is related to area of Sahel, which might actually become more green and from the environmental perspective more livable in the future. What is, however, clear that the environmental risks are increasingly recognized. So this is an annual assessment from the World Economic Forum. And especially if we look at the risks with 10-year time span, we see that all of the top risks are really environmental. Extreme weather events, biodiversity loss, critical change to Earth system, natural resource shortages. So with the longer time span, it looks like there is a clear understanding of the magnitude of the risks. One more typical feature of environmental issues is the cross-sectoral nature of problems. So addressing environmental problems typically requires the involvement of multiple government sectors. Like if we talk about climate policy, it's like energy sector, transport sector, agricultural sector. They all have a big impact on the field. So it's not just a single ministry that can solve the issues. Another example, air pollution and microplastics are okay, they are harmful for the environment, but they are also increasingly significant public health risks. So also from the problem side, you see that the topics are interlinked. In the INTOSAI Working Group on Environmental Auditing, we recently tried to thematize these interlinkages with our Nexus project on biodiversity and climate. So that's where really this climate, biodiversity and human come together. And we published not only a report, but also an audit question bank of suggestions for audit questions, but also sources of criteria. So we hope this is very useful for auditors, and we also hope that this facilitates the thinking, like if you audit climate policy, that you would remember to take into account the biodiversity impacts of those policies too, so that we don't end up in a situation where auditors make recommendations that would be harmful for biodiversity. Environmental issues also essentially cross borders, so they do not respect national borders. Problems can have also cascading impacts across borders. And effective management of environmental issues often requires cooperation with neighboring countries, for instance, if there is a shared water body. Or it might require that at the global level, as is the case with climate policies. So this is just one map showing how the drainage basins, these big river basins, how they are located quite often in several countries. And then the fact what happens upstream has also a big impact on downstream. So this requires cooperation. But this cooperation could also occur between the audit offices. So there are many cooperative audits where neighboring countries or countries in one region join forces and do joint audits or cooperative audits on common issues. So this is an example from Lake Chad area where audit offices around the lake were auditing the coordinating body. So it's really a marvelous example also of sustainability issue, because drying of the Lake Chad affects so many, has so many impacts on the livelihood, on the peace in the area, on the economy. So it's really a great example. Finally, environment can be scrutinized as part of sustainable development. So it's really a key concept, and it involves integrating social, environmental, and economic objectives and scrutinizing issues from both national and global perspectives, and extending the timescale to consider future generations. So the current sustainable development framework in the world is the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals. We also asked in our recent survey, what SDGs the SAIs have audited. So we received this very nice, colorful answer. We've also tried to thematize this economy, environment, social interlinkage with policy coherence concept, and tried to consider that you can look at policy coherence from a horizontal perspective, where you try to integrate different sectors, but also from vertical perspective, from various governance levels, from local to national and global. One attempt to thematize these interlinkages there are some tools to do that. This is one developed by Stockholm Environment Institute that we have experimented in the WGEA Secretariat and together with the students in the University of Helsinki, and we found it actually a very good way to try to find interlinkages between the SDGs, so that it's not only, I have it here, individual SDGs, but rather this dynamic concept or dynamic perspective interlinking the various SDGs. In addition, we've also, with the University of Helsinki, developed this global interlinkage perspective, these spillovers that are unintended impacts, like elsewhere in the world. Like the policies we do, they might have also unintended consequences elsewhere. And ideally, domestic strategies should avoid generating negative spillovers in other countries. One example is the biofuels if global north wants to use more biofuels, we can look like what happens in the global south. Is it so that production of palm oil is done with the expense of food production or biodiversity, just in order for the north to kind of fill in their biofuel targets? We've also studied these interlinkages, for instance, in the area of mining. So, as I mentioned, these specific elements in environmental auditing, that's not necessarily an exhaustive list. You might have other good ideas, but these you can find in the recent guidance on environmental auditing that was adopted in July 25. So if you want to read more on those, you can read the document. Now I would provide you some audit examples. First of all, we have a newsletter, Green Lines, that INTOSAI USA edits it, and it's published twice a year. And I just looked at one Green Lines it always has audit examples, like one Green Lines, and what kind of methods and approaches these audit examples used. So INTOSAI Czech Republic had audited 20 projects. INTOSAI Finland had assessed 3 funding schemes. INTOSAI Kuwait has assessed climate risks across several sectors. And when it comes to methods, INTOSAI USA had analyzed laws and regulations, interviewed officials, and they had also done a literature review. INTOSAI India had used GIS software, like this geospatial data, and INTOSAI Pakistan had developed citizen participatory audit. So this is just an example, like how many approaches, how many methods science can use in their environmental audits. Now, if you look, for instance, climate audits, some audit the whole policy and some specific issue or fund. So here's an example from Philippines, an audit on National Climate Change Action Plan, like a really big action plan covering both mitigation, so reduction of climate greenhouse gases, and adaptation, so adapting to the changing environments. And another example from European Court of Auditors, where they scoped the audits on adaptation. So if Philippines had the whole climate policy, here the focus was on adaptation. Or then scoping into a more specific problem, like here INTOSAI USA with the wildfire smoke, obviously increased by the changing climate, but the focus on the health risk that this unhealthy wildfire smoke causes. Another example from Finland, focusing on energy investments, which are supposed to drive green transition, but where the auditors found several issues. For instance, not prioritizing new technologies as much as was supposed to be done, over budgeting, and so on. Here is also one example where the focus goes beyond the climate mitigation or adaptation to more like social aspect, just transition. So how about those people who lose their jobs because of climate policy? For instance, if the coal mines close, like how are these people supported in order for them to secure their livelihoods? And here the main argument was that the coal-fired electricity phase-out is the first of several transitions to a low-carbon economy. And understanding how these workers and communities are effective would be a learning opportunity for the future. Very good collection on adaptation-related audits. I already referred to this earlier. So Global Cooperative Audit on Climate Change Adaptation Actions. It was supported by WGEA and INTOSAI Development Initiative. Over 50 audits made on various topics on climate adaptation, on sea level rise and coastal erosion, on water management and disaster risk reduction. This video is from the Pasai region, where of course there are low-lying countries and they are particularly prone to sea level rise and disaster risks. Here's one audit example from Marshall Islands, and just a very striking example how these sea walls have been built in a piecemeal manner without an overall strategy. And if I consider this whole like a summary of these cooperative audits, like this non-strategic finance is one of the major findings, as is the fact that adaptation planning and plans are not enough, but now we need also implementation. So that's the key, and there's much less progress visible. There's also much more need for data and monitoring. We provided in this summary report messages to governments, to international stakeholders, and to SAIs. And here are our key messages to SAIs. Assess planning and implementation of plans, examine the implementation gap, audit inclusiveness, examine coordination, evaluate finance, strengthen monitoring and evaluation with your audit findings, and be proactive. Besides audit examples on climate change, I have here some examples on waste management. There's a recent audit from INTOSAI USA on textile waste. The problem being that textile waste causes harmful effects to the environment, while the amount of the waste has increased because of fast fashion. So it's very much related to our consumption cultures. SAI reviewed issues related to textile waste and recycling and recommended for better coordination and federal action to reduce the waste and advance textile recycling. Another interesting example is from INTOSAI UK, where they reviewed waste crime. And this is just an example of the various categories of waste crime, ranging from landfill tax non-compliance to illegal waste sites, illegal export of waste, and illegal waste dumping, as well as abuse of exemptions of waste permits or offences related to producer responsibility obligations. So this is just an example showing the variety of criminality related to waste sector. And here's another recent audit from INTOSAI Canada addressing specifically the zero plastic waste scheme of the government. So if 2016, 70% of plastic waste went to the landfill, and the target is that this doesn't happen in 2030. And what are the obstacles there? With the key message that there's very much like information missing, and if you don't have that information, you can't assess whether you are going to reach the target. Waste is also a good topic for coordinated audits. This is already an older cooperative audit in Europe on European waste shipment regulation. So this is really, as in the waste criminality example of UK, showed also this waste, both legal and illegal waste expert is an important part of how we try to tackle with our waste. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the support that the INTOSAI WGEA provides. This is first a visualization of all of the work that WGEA has done over the years. In the roots is SAI's internal work, as well as professional pronouncement, and the tree itself shows the evolution of topics that WGEA has worked with, starting very much with water, waste, sustainable development, biodiversity, and broadening towards natural resources, and since 2010 increasingly to climate, energy, and transport. And these are our most recent publications that I've already referred to earlier, as well as the guidance document merging 3 outdated GID documents. This is also a good source of inspiration. Our 2 large cooperative audits, I've already referred to both of them, Climate Scanner, rapid reviews of countries' climate governance, public policies and finance. And the second round of assessments include 103 audits, with one of the key findings that many governments are struggling with knowing how much they spend on climate action. Climate Scanner was one of the winners of the 4th INTOSAI WGEA award. It was acknowledgement of inspiration, with other awards going to SAI Philippines and Tanzania on innovative audits and emerging environmental issues. And another great source of inspiration, the cooperative audit on climate adaptation. So if you plan to audit that, I strongly recommend familiarizing with this publication and all the audits that are available on the IDI website. We've also piloted an agile environmental audit clinic support model. This is a model where SAIs can ask just for 1 hour consultation online to discuss any issue related to environmental auditing. So anything that bothers or puzzles you, you can ask for a consultation slot. So we did a pilot, but we'll continue with the clinics in 2026, and SAI Thailand will be leading those clinics. We also, of course, organize meetings. This is our latest assembly in July in Malta, where the main topic was auditing our blue planet, meaning the water. And that's also where SAI Finland handed over the chairmanship to SAI Thailand as the next chair of the INTOSAI for next 6 years, while SAI Maldives continues as vice chair. And in the next work plan, big topics of pollution, water, and Nexus climate biodiversity water will be in. Finally, I'd like to say how to seek expertise. Few words on that. There are many ways to benchmark. There are all the WGEA publications with audit examples. There's the large audit database, and there are multilateral environmental agreements. You could also reach out for external expertise, collaborate with universities or researchers, call them for a focus group meeting, or commission a technical analysis for an expert. You can also seek cooperation with other SAIs. You can join WGEA or regional WGEA, get in contact with other SAIs working in your region. And you can also engage in cooperative audits. For the conclusion, I would like to stress the importance of systemic approach. So even if we make very targeted, very focused audits, it's good to understand that issues are always interlinked. We tried to do this interlinking on a previous work plan period between our projects on plastic waste, climate finance, and sustainable transport. And just to mention you one interesting interlinkage between transport and plastic waste. Now when we are trying to move towards less fossil-dependent transport, shift to electric cars, the cars tend to be more heavy, which means that the car tires, there comes more microplastic out of them, which goes to the atmosphere and ends up in the sea. So that's a very specific, interesting interlinkage that shows how connected various problems are, or solutions and problems, or sometimes solutions cause new problems. Recently, we worked with Nexus Climate Biodiversity, a project led by INTOSAI Canada, and there are trade-offs, especially in renewable energy sector. But there are also very many positive interlinkages, especially if we talk about nature-based solutions. And one question is also, should we more often consider climate mitigation and climate adaptation together? That might help creating those interlinkages or positive synergies. And this is a slide where we try to organize, or the project leaders of this period, INTOSAI Canada, Nexus Project, INTOSAI UK Environmental Auditing, European Court of Auditors and USA Green Fiscal Policy Tools, and Sustainability Reporting, INTOSAI Thailand and INTOSAI Indonesia. So how these various topics are actually interlinked, and on top of that bringing in the climate scanner and cooperative audit on adaptation. So this is an attempt to really consider how these topics are linked to each other. And one more word, like when you study these various environmental problems and environmental policy issues, you might easily get carried away and sometimes even forget that you are, after all, an auditor. So Supreme Audit Institutions shouldn't do the similar work that various environmental research institutes are doing. No, we are government external auditors, and we are paying attention to the effective use of taxpayers' money, the public spending, the accountability, the effectiveness of all of this policy implementation. So how could I put it? Environmental auditors' role is not to save the world. It is to make the saving cost efficient and cost effective. Once more, key resources, publications, large audit database, and also trainings. So these trainings organized by ISED, both on the spot and online in webinar formats, and massive online open courses organized by INTOSAI Estonia. I thank you very much and wish you all success in your environmental audit field. And don't hesitate to stay in touch. You can contact me anytime. Feel free to get in touch.